Let me start with something that might make you uncomfortable. The thing most Americans spend their entire adult lives chasing, saving for, investing toward, sacrificing for, might not be freedom at all. It might be the most expensive misunderstanding in personal finance. I've been investing long enough to watch people hit their numbers, close their laptops for the last time, and tell themselves, "I've won." And I've also been around long enough to watch what happens after the applause fades. Because money doesn't ruin people when they don't have it. Money ruins people when it stops giving them a reason to wake up. We're told that retirement is the finish line, that financial independence means you finally get to stop. Stop working, stop striving, stop being needed. But here's the part nobody puts in the glossy brochures or the retirement calculators. Your brain and your body were never designed for a life built around stopping. And if you think this conversation doesn't apply to you because you're younger, busier, or still grinding, that's exactly why it does. I want to tell you about a man I'll call Dave, not because his story is unique, but because it's painfully familiar to anyone who spent decades doing things the responsible way. Dave worked as an engineer for over 30 years at a manufacturing company in the Midwest. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't lucky. He was disciplined. He maxed out his 401, invested consistently, avoided lifestyle inflation, paid off his house early, and ignored the noise. By his early 60s, he had around $1, $4 million invested, a paid-off home, and a pension that covered most of his basic expenses. On paper, Dave was a textbook success story. He threw the retirement party, accepted the gold watch, cleared out his desk, and walked out smiling. He believed, like so many people do, that reaching the number meant reaching peace. And for a little while, it felt true. He slept in, he played golf, he caught up on the shows he never had time to watch. He told himself this was what freedom looked like. From the outside, nothing was wrong. In fact, most people would have said he was living the dream. But investing teaches you something most people never learn until it's too late. Early returns can hide long-term risk. And what came next wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, slowly, and almost invisibly. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The days were calm, comfortable, predictable. But comfort has a way of turning on you when it stretches too far. After a few months, the house projects were done. The early morning tea times stopped feeling special. By the middle of the year, Dave was filling his days without really remembering how they were filled. Television bled into afternoons. Afternoons bled into evenings. Time stopped feeling earned and started feeling endless. The structure he'd lived inside for decades vanished overnight, and no one warned him how disorienting that would be. Conversations became shorter. Decisions became smaller. There was nothing pulling him forward anymore. No deadlines. No expectations. No one waiting on him. By the end of the first year, Dave couldn't tell you the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't surface level. He wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. That's what made it dangerous. He was numb. And numbness is quieter than pain, but it does more damage. Eventually, the doctor visits started. Then the prescriptions. Then the diagnosis that no one expects when they've done everything right. What broke Dave wasn't age or money or bad luck. It was the sudden absence of purpose. And here's the part most people miss. Nothing catastrophic happened. No crash, no mistake. Just a slow erosion of meaning that no financial plan had ever accounted for. Here's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because the easiest way to dismiss Dave is to call him unlucky. An exception, a sad case. But Dave isn't an outlier. He's closer to the statistical norm than most people want to admit. I've seen versions of this story play out again and again. Different careers, different cities, different account balances, same ending. We tell ourselves that if we save enough, invest wisely, and avoid obvious mistakes, the rest will take care of itself. That belief is comforting. It's also dangerously incomplete. What happened to Dave wasn't a personal failure. It was a structural one. The plan worked financially and failed humanly. And once you see that distinction, you can't unsee it. Because if this were just about one man making poor choices, there'd be nothing to learn here. But when the same outcome repeats across millions of people, The problem isn't the people, it's the model. Once you start looking for answers beyond anecdotes, the picture gets even harder to ignore. Multiple long-term studies tracking retirees across the United States and Europe have found the same disturbing pattern. Health often declines fastest in the first few years after people stop working. Not because they suddenly age overnight, and not because they ran out of money, but because something essential was removed all at once. Early retirement has been linked to higher rates of depression, increased risk of cognitive decline, and a measurable rise in mortality compared to people who continue working longer. And before anyone rushes to explain this away, researchers accounted for income, prior health, and lifestyle factors. The effect didn't disappear. Something about the act of stopping itself accelerated the breakdown. What makes this especially uncomfortable is that the numbers don't care how much you liked your job. People who couldn't wait to retire often experience the same decline as those who loved their careers. Because this isn't about passion. It's about stimulation, structure, and being needed. Your brain is an organ, and like any organ, it weakens when demand suddenly drops. For most adults, work, imperfect as it is, provides daily cognitive load, social contact, and a sense of contribution. Remove all of that without replacing it deliberately, and the system doesn't rebalance. It collapses quietly. This is the part no retirement calculator shows you, because it doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. This is where most financial conversations quietly go wrong, because we use two ideas as if they mean the same thing when they absolutely do not. Retirement is about stopping. Financial independence is about choosing. Retirement tells you that freedom begins when obligation ends, when your calendar empties, when no one needs anything from you anymore. Financial independence says something very different. Freedom begins when money stops being the reason you say yes to things you don't care about. The math can look identical on paper. A portfolio that generates $60,000 a year on a 4% withdrawal rate doesn't care whether you spend your days on a couch or building something meaningful. But your nervous system does. Under the traditional retirement model, people quit their jobs and fill the silence with distractions: golf, television, travel, consumption, mistaking stimulation for purpose. Under financial independence, the job you didn't choose disappears, but work itself doesn't. It transforms. You still wake up with intention. You still solve problems. You still contribute, learn, and engage, just without the pressure of needing a paycheck. The financial outcome is the same. The human outcome is not. And once you understand that distinction, it forces a much harder question, because if money isn't the finish line, then a lot of our spending habits start to look less like freedom and more like avoidance. Here's the connection almost no one in personal finance wants to make explicit, because it exposes something uncomfortable about how we really use money. When people lose purpose, they don't sit still, they consume, not because they need more things, but because consumption creates a temporary sense of motion. Buying feels like progress. Upgrading feels like growth. Spending feels like living. When work no longer provides structure, identity, or challenge, money steps in to simulate those feelings. New cars, bigger homes, more travel, better experiences not chosen out of joy, but out of restlessness. This is how lifestyle inflation quietly accelerates after freedom. The calendar empties, the days blur together, and spending becomes a way to mark time. I've watched people who spent decades carefully investing suddenly start withdrawing faster than planned. Not because markets failed, but because their lives lacked friction. Without something meaningful to push against, money turns into entertainment, distraction, and emotional regulation. And the cruel irony is this: the more you spend trying to feel alive, the more anxious you become about running out. What was supposed to buy peace starts creating fear. This isn't a discipline problem. It's a design problem. We built a financial plan that assumed money could replace meaning, and it can't. Not for long. Most people spend years obsessing over the financial side of freedom, and almost no time preparing for the life that comes after it. Run the numbers, hit the target, and assume everything else will sort itself out. That assumption is where things quietly fall apart. Money planning is mechanical. You calculate expenses, apply a withdrawal rate, build a portfolio, and adjust for risk. Purpose doesn't work that way. It doesn't appear on a spreadsheet, and it doesn't magically show up the day your income becomes optional. It has to be built long before it's needed. The people who struggle most after they reach financial independence are almost always the ones who told themselves they'd figure it out later. Later arrives, and there's nothing there. No structure outside of work, no identity that isn't tied to a job title, no community that wasn't conveniently provided by an office. And by then, the habits of disengagement are already set. You can't improvise meaning on demand. Purpose requires practice, relationships, skill, and commitment, things that compound slowly, just like money does. Ignore that side of the equation, and financial independence becomes a hollow victory. This is the question I wish more people asked themselves before they ever opened a retirement account or ran a projection. If money were no longer a factor, if tomorrow your expenses were covered, what would pull you out of bed? Not what you'd do to pass the time, not how you'd relax. What would demand your attention? What problem would you feel responsible for? What skill would you still want to sharpen, even if no one paid you for it? Most people can't answer that, not because they're shallow, but because they've been too busy surviving. Work filled the gap. Money became the stand-in for meaning. And when that pressure disappears, the silence is deafening. This is why financial independence without purpose feels disorienting instead of liberating. You didn't lose your job, you lost your orientation. And until you answer that question honestly, no amount of investing discipline will give you the peace you're expecting. Here's the reframe I've arrived at after decades of watching people chase numbers and call it a plan. The goal is not to reach a point where you don't have to do anything. The goal is to reach a point where you only do what you choose. Those two futures look similar from a distance, but they feel completely different when you're living inside them. One is defined by absence, no obligations, no pressure, no demands. The other is defined by intention, chosen work, chosen problems, chosen contribution. One leads to drift, the other creates direction. If your vision of freedom is built entirely around stopping, you're designing a life that asks nothing of you, and that's exactly what starts taking things away. Aim instead for a life that still needs you, just not your paycheck. Because the people who age well aren't the ones who stepped away from effort. They're the ones who kept showing up for something that mattered to them.